So that is now recording. So hello everyone, welcome. I think a couple more people have joined us. My name's Hannah. I am the curator here at the Florence Nightingale Museum. That means I get to look after all of the wonderful objects that we have here at the museum. I look after all their documentation, their cataloguing. I also get to do a lot of our interpretation and exhibition programming as well. So getting to do lots of research about the collection and everything Florence Nightingale. The museum has been open since 1989, but our history goes back to the early 20th century when one of the hospital matrons and superintendents of the Nightingale Training School started to collect objects that were associated with Nightingale. These were held at the Nightingale Training School as a teaching aid, but by the 1970s it has been decided that a museum should be created so that all of these wonderful objects could be publicly accessible. It was at that point that the Florence Nightingale Museum Trust was born, and a few years later the museum opened its doors. We have stayed on that same site, that's where we are today, and as long as we've been here, we've had a very strong relationship with St Thomas's Hospital. We are an independent charity and we don't receive any government funding, so every bit of support from all our donors and visitors really helps us to continue telling Nightingale's story. I am delighted that this evening I am joined by David Stewart. David is a former head teacher, a historian and researcher from Nottinghamshire, and he is also a member of the Nottinghamshire History of Nursing group. In recent times, David has been researching a number of women who originated from Nottinghamshire and travelled to London to join the Nightingale Training School. David first got in contact with me a couple of years ago when he was asking a couple of questions about a couple of the nurses who went to the Nightingale Training School from Nottinghamshire, and in particular in relation to one of the objects that we had in our collection here. We've actually kept in touch since, and when David mentioned to me earlier this year that he was doing a talk about some of his research at the UK Association for the History of Nursing colloquium earlier this year, I really wanted to hear this talk and find out more about what he'd been researching. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend the colloquium, but I did ask David if he would be interested in presenting the talk for the museum. I'm therefore delighted that he has actually been able to join us at the museum, and I've actually been able to meet you in person for the first time this evening. But before I hand over to David, I just wanted to share with everyone this very important object that we first got in contact about. So the Nightingale Training School, just for a little bit of context, it's considered to be the first secular, so the first non-religious training school for nursing in the world. It was set up in the years following the Crimean War using a fund which had been named the Nightingale Fund, which had been money had been raised throughout the Crimean War and named in Nightingale's honour. The training school officially opened in July 1860 and continued at St Thomas's Hospital right the way through to the 1990s, when the school closed at St Thomas's but merged with the Nightingale faculty at King's College London, where it is still existing today. Within our collection, we have a huge number of objects that are associated with the Nightingale Training School and Nightingale Nurses, as the nurses who went through the school came to be known. Many of these objects date from across the 20th century, but we do have a small number of objects that date from the early years of the school. On display in the museum, we have, which is personally one of my favourite objects, a uniform dating from the 1890s, one of the probationer uniforms, that the sort of blue striped dress, very fashionable for the time, but probably very impractical for women doing their work. We also have lots of documents that relate to the early years of the training school too. But the one I want to show you here, I will just pop my gloves on because I need to put them on to show everyone. I'm going to use vinyl gloves to hold this object because it does have gilt edges, so that's metal, so just to protect that, and also because it is photographs inside as well. These are very susceptible to the oils that we have on our hands. You might normally see white cotton gloves on the TV. We don't use these anymore, mostly because the cotton can snag on any tears and make any damage worse, but also the oils can still soak through the cotton onto objects. So these vinyl gloves are a much better way of protecting the objects that we use. So what I wanted to show you today was this small photograph album that we have. It's normally on display in our bookcase section, which is all about Nightingale's later life. But this dates from 1867. This album was given to a Miss Florence Lees, who she didn't actually attend the school, but she observed a lot that was going on. Her family wouldn't let her actually become a probationer and complete her training, but she became very close to Florence Nightingale. So when she left the school to go and travel the world observing other Nightingale, other training schools, and other hospitals and what they were doing in there with their nursing provision, she was gifted this album by some of the nurses that she had worked with. This album dates from 1867. You can see, sorry, this is trying to make sure everyone can see. This is 1867, it says St Thomas's Hospital. On the inside, there is an inscription. Unfortunately, the spine is not in its best, so it's very difficult to open it, but there it just says about Florence Lees from all of the sisters, nurses and probationers. So inside we have about 30 photographs that all date from the 1860s and all women who worked at St Thomas's, many of which were also Nightingale nurses. So on the first page, we have a photograph of Sarah Wardroper, who was the first matron, a matron at St Thomas's who became the first superintendent of the Nightingale Training School. And then looking further inside the book, we have, just struggling. So we have, there's lots of photos. They're very similar, but they show lots of the different women, many of whom were working class women or women who, we wouldn't normally have a record of. So it's a fantastic object that we have here. Unfortunately, not all of them are named, but there are a few that are. And the reason why I'm showing you this today is because some of these are actually the Nottinghamshire nurses that we're going to hear about in just a moment. So it really is a very lovely object that we have here in our collection. So without further ado, I think I will pass over to David. So bear with me just one moment. I will just get the slides. Hopefully everyone can see that. Let me just minimize that as well. I think. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Well, good evening, everyone. And the title of the talk, as you can see, is The Nottinghamshire Nightingales. Our story begins not in Nottinghamshire, but in the Prestwich Asylum near Manchester. A former nurse, now suffering with dementia, was admitted in 1889. In her case notes, it records that she thought she was 20 and that the year was 1860. However, when prompted, she would recall Miss Nightingale and the hospital at Netley. Netley was the large military hospital in Hampshire. The nurse was Mary Barker, the first nurse to be recorded on the Nightingale School of Nursing register in 1860. And importantly for our story today is that she came from Beeston, just outside Nottingham. This is a tale of 25 working class women from Nottinghamshire who went to train as nurses at St Thomas's Hospital in the 1860s. They were not the Ooners, the Pearl or Little Sister, those more middle-class women favoured by Nightingale, but the very women, those of the servant class, for whom Nightingale thought the training scheme most useful. As Hannah has said, in recognition of her work in the Crimean War, the British people raised some £45,000, and Florence Nightingale directed that it should be used to create a school for nursing. The Nightingale Fund Council, appointed by her in 1856. Took 4 years before her plan came to fruition. The surviving archives of the Council and the Nightingale School of Nursing are held at the London Archives. My interest in the Nottinghamshire Nightingales came about when trying to prove whether a hospital matron in Nottingham was a Nightingale nurse. She was not, but realising that a significant number of these early probationers had a Nottinghamshire link. So my study has been based on the probationer's record recorded in Book A, or the Red Book, which dates from 1860 to 1871. As Mary was the first, so the final probationer in the book, Alice Keywood, was also from Nottinghamshire. Remarkably, 10% of the total, some 25 women, came from Nottinghamshire. And indeed, a third of the women who accompanied Agnes Jones to the Liverpool workhouse were also from Nottinghamshire. Nottingham, sited in the East Midlands, was an expanding industrial town, with a growing industrial population centred around the hosiery and lace industries. Nottingham had a severe overcrowding situation, with many workers living in poorly constructed back-to-back housing with very poor sanitation. There was a high demand for female labour, and the 1861 census revealed that there were 7,000 more women than men in Nottingham. So who were these women who went to St Thomas's, and why did so many come from the same county? Surely there would be opportunities to train closer to home. In February 1860, the guardians of the Nottingham workhouse purchased a copy of Nightingale's Notes on Nursing for the use of the untrained and pauper nurses in the workhouse. But they were years away from considering trained nurses. A local doctor, Laurie Marsh, proposed a nursing institute to train nurses in conjunction with the General Hospital. But the governors refused his proposal, so he next decided to send women to train elsewhere, and an opportunity was about to present itself. In London, the Nightingale Fund Council finally came to an agreement with the authorities at St Thomas's Hospital for the training school to be sited there, but they gave themselves little time. With a course due to begin on the 24th of June 1860, the first provincial newspaper adverts were only being placed in early June. These were placed in several regional newspapers, although one has not yet been found in a Nottinghamshire paper. So how did people know about this new training scheme? The members of the Nightingale Fund Council were encouraged to use their networks and contacts. One of the Fund Council members was the Dr. William Bowman, a close ally of Florence Nightingale, and his wife was a Unitarian and cousin to Charles Paget, the MP for Nottingham. Charles Paget's sister-in-law, Harriet Tebbit, had served in the Crimea as superintendent at the Scutari General Hospital and was thus well known to Nightingale. For those of you who know the painting The Mission of Mercy, which hangs in the National Portrait Gallery, will perhaps know Miss Tebbit, who stands at the top left-hand corner of the painting. The Unitarian network was a powerful force, and in Nottingham, Unitarians held the majority of public posts. The wife of the town clerk was Anne Enfield, whose family connections included Martineaus, Greggs, Rathbones, Needhams and Phillipses. Her best friend Catherine Turner, the cousin of Harriet Martineau, the economist, ran a girls' school in Nottingham which attracted girls nationally from many leading Unitarian families. The secretary to the Fund Council was Hugh Clough, and his sister Jemima was well known to Catherine Turner and Anne Enfield through Harriet Martineau. She was later to become the principal of Newnham College. The importance of Anne Enfield in promoting the Nottinghamshire women cannot be underestimated. Before her death in 1865 from cancer, she had recommended 18 of the 25 women. Well educated, she was keen to promote the cause of the training of nurses, as well as providing opportunities for working women to improve themselves. She had already established a home with a housekeeper to support single working women. No other referees came near to this number of women, Agnes Ewart from Manchester, with 5 being the next biggest single sponsor. Like Enfield, she was a Unitarian, attending chapel with Mrs. Gaskell and Mark Phillips, the first MP for Manchester, who was, of course, a cousin of Mrs. Enfield. From 1863, Anne Enfield, maybe her health already becoming worse, had begun to encourage others in Nottingham to support her in providing recommendations, and the institution which linked the majority of these was Bromley House Library. In Nottingham, Enfield's father and aunt had been founder members of the library, and it provided a meeting point for the middle classes of Nottingham from a wide range of religious denominations. Enfield was also recommending women for training into other hospitals, such as the Liverpool Royal Infirmary, and I think further research is needed in this area. So let's examine the background of these women. These were all working class women, many of whom would have been working since the age of 8 or 10. So when they went to train, say at 32, they'd already been working for 20 years. Whilst there was a lady's maid and a milliner, the majority worked in the lace industry, which fell outside the Factory Acts until 1862. The opportunity for alternative employment must have been very attractive, for conditions in the lace dressing rooms were particularly bad, with women and girls often working in temperatures of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers were reported as having a pale and bloodless face and skin. Many were in constant perspiration, becoming languid, fainting being usual. Consumption was very common amongst warehouse girls, and some had died from it. Of the 25 probationers, 6 were dismissed as unsuitable, about the same average of all probationers, and at least 2 of these were dismissed on concern that they were consumptive and not strong enough. Mrs. Enfield was never happy with any dismissals, and Mrs. Wardroper had to point out to Nightingale that whilst the majority of the Nottinghamshire nurses were fine, Enfield's judgment of the women was not always right. Wardroper left it to Mrs. Nightingale to deal with Mrs. Enfield. Nottingham, from the time of the Civil War, had been seen as a city of protest, and nonconformity was a strong presence. The 1851 religious census records that 70% of church and chapel attenders in Nottingham were nonconformist. And so whilst 70% of the Red Book total were Church of England, the Nottinghamshire cohort was 79% nonconformist, with 1 Catholic. Mrs. Enfield, being an educated Unitarian, supported women from all denominations, whilst others, particularly clergymen, only supported those of their own congregation. A requirement of the probationers was that they should be able to read and write, and whilst we don't know where each woman received her education, from the 1830s the government was giving grants to British and national schools in Nottinghamshire. The nonconformists supported a large number of Sunday schools, some of which taught writing as well as reading. The Methodist Sunday School in Hucknall, where Alice Hayward lived, was particularly popular with parents as the children were taught writing. Elizabeth Foster from Wotton had the benefit of a Wesleyan school in Bingham, based on the Glasgow system. The Glasgow system promoted trained teachers rather than pupil teachers. The People's College in Nottingham ran classes both for children and adults. And Harriet Martineau told Nightingale that Elizabeth Sumter, the headmistress, was using the notes on nursing as part of her teaching. A high proportion of nonconformists, with probable link to temperance, meant that there were no issues of insobriety amongst the Nottinghamshire cohort. For all these women, family was a very important factor in their ability to leave Nottingham. The majority were single. Some were youngest daughters, so might have been expected to help with the care of an elderly parent. Some had a sibling who undertook that role, or some had to wait for their parents to die. For Anne Blundell, a widow, she needed her parents to be very much alive, as she needed them to provide childcare to her 2 young children while she went away to London. One woman was separated from her husband, a condition that Mrs. Wardroper, the matron, appreciated was a reality for some of her nurses. 2/3 would go on to marry, in several instances to men far younger. For one nurse, Ellen Wrigley, having been widowed, was able to resume her nursing career, becoming matron of the Mansfield Cottage Hospital, the training standing her in good stead for employment as a widow. The council had agreed on the age for acceptance being between 25 and 35, though clearly what age was given to Mrs. Wardroper was not always accurate, either adding on years because they were too young, or losing years because they were over 35. Marion Bradbury was only 21, although claimed to be older. Deborah Burgess was pushing 40, but claimed to be 34. The age limit, however, was not absolute, and Ellen Patterson was admitted at 39. For some, the journey to London would be their first time on a train, and the first time to the metropolis. 3 had lived in Calais, not uncommon in Nottingham history because of the lace trade, so would have had some experience of travel. But for the majority, this would have been an amazing new adventure. I'm presuming that Mrs. Enfield, or funds from the Nottingham Nursing Institute, helped with train fare and other subsidies. Welcomed by Mrs. Wardroper, the matron, and Lucy Bull, her assistant, the women were to be paid £10 a year, and after the completion of a further year, would be added to the register of trained nurses, with a bonus of £5 for first-class nurses, such as Mary Barker, and £3 for second class, such as Eliza Trueman. Registration, however, was not automatic, and Marion Bradbury, who had an eye for the medical students, had to wait 2 more years until it was considered she had calmed down. There was an expectation that the nurses would be attached to the school for at least 3 years and be prepared to go where they were sent. Others have written about the training provided, particularly the classes provided by Whitfield, the house surgeon, although very little about the practical nursing provided by Lucy Bull and her team of sisters. Other authors have been dismissive of the impact of nursing in that first decade in terms of turning out future leaders, but I think they have missed the impact to the individual nurses in terms of being offered a professional paid training, the chance to travel, and experience new environments, and taking on the role of head nurse or sister, often under an untrained matron. Not always easy, as Elizabeth Perotti found in Leicester. For those with marriage in mind, the chance for a wider choice of husband, not just Bert from Bulwell, but Sid from Swansea or Will from Winchester. As I've said, 2/3 would go on to get married, becoming mothers or stepmothers. I intend today to give 3 or 4 examples of the careers of the probationers, highlighting both the opportunities on offer, but also the prejudice faced because of their class. When Eliza Trueman retired from Barts in 1893, she had completed 30 years of nursing, working under some of the better-known matrons of the period. She and her younger sister Maria had been lace menders before commencing at St Thomas's in 1863. The school had now moved to temporary accommodation in Surrey Gardens. Eliza had an exemplary attendance record. She worked under Sisters Elizabeth, Queen, Edward, King, and Accident. It was the tradition in most London hospitals that sisters were known by the name of the ward. After nursing at St Thomas's, the 2 sisters were chosen to accompany Agnes Jones as part of a team of 12 nurses being sent to the Brownlow Poor Law Infirmary in Liverpool in May 1865. The conditions were grim, yet with hard work and determination, the nursing team began to make a difference, training up new nurses, including the Trueman's niece, Lucy Scott, who had returned from France. In 1866, they were rewarded with a signed photo of Florence Nightingale, a letter from William Rathbone, and a certificate, as we can see here. During their time there, Rathbone took his young niece, Rosalind Paget, later the Inspector General of the Queen's Jubilee Institute, to visit the nurses in Liverpool. The death of Agnes Jones in 1868 had a profound effect on the scheme, and the nurses became dissatisfied. Eliza and Maria found themselves posts as head nurses at the Middlesex Hospital, just at the time of the arrival of the redoubtable new lady superintendent, Godiva Thorold. She quickly dismissed Maria as unfit for the post of sister, whereas Eliza was said to be a conscientious woman and an excellent nurse. After 3 years of Miss Thorold, famous for chasing cats through the wards, it was probably more than enough, and Eliza had clearly decided to have a change, taking a post as Sister Colston at Bart's Hospital. Yes, that man Colston gets everywhere. Eliza would remain as Sister Colston for the next 20 years. Here we can see the two sisters when they were at Bart's, working under matrons Frances Drake, Maria Machin, Ethel Gordon Manson, and Isabella Stewart, seeing the development of the training school at Bart's. And you can see here Eliza sitting directly in front of Ethel Gordon Manson, who of course became Ethel Gordon Fenwick, the first nurse on the register and the great campaigner for registration of nurses, who also had Nottinghamshire links, and her ashes are buried in Nottinghamshire. Eliza's sister Maria, who after leaving the Middlesex had worked as a matron at the Kendal Cottage Hospital and then a London workhouse school, joined her sister at Bart's as Sister Elizabeth in 1877. Both sisters were awarded nursing prizes. Maria retired in 1890, dying of cancer 10 years later. Eliza retired in 1893 with a well-earned pension. The new editor of the Nursing Record, the same Mrs. Gordon Fenwick, noting her long and honourable career. She would go on to marry at the age of 62 and died in 1920. Her death was recorded in the Nursing Times by the matron of St Thomas's, Alicia Lloyd Still. I want to turn next to Anne Blundell. Whilst most of the Nottinghamshire women were single, two had young children. One was a widow, the other separated. Anne Blundell was a young widow with two young children to support. It may have been the series of lectures which Dr. Laurie Marsh gave on nursing in the spring of 1864 which inspired Anne Blundell to consider nursing as a career. Anne, with the support of Mrs. Enfield and the Wesleyan minister William Trevay, arrived at St Thomas's in October 1864. She could only do this as her parents and her unmarried sisters cared for her two children. What money she would be earning, she would be sending home to support her children. During her training, while she had 21 days absence for neuralgia, she only had 4 days leave of absence. Whether she was able to visit her children, we do not know. On completion of her training, when Mrs. Wardroper noted that Nurse Blundell was of moderate abilities, willing and attentive to patients, she remained at St Thomas's working on male wards. She clearly did not consider returning to Nottingham, and in June 1868 she was sent with several other nurses under the Lady Superintendent Sarah Freeman to the new Royal Hampshire County Hospital at Winchester, which Nightingale herself had scrutinised the plans. As Nightingale was to say, no need for day rooms. If patients were fit enough to enjoy a day room, they were fit enough to go home. It might well have been galling to the nurses that Freeman, the lady superintendent, who had been sent to St Thomas's by the Winchester Board for training, had only done 6 months' training. The nurses were soon involved in supporting the training of probationers, some of whom were destined to be sent out as private nurses to supplement the finances of the hospital. Back in London, the new St Thomas's Hospital had opened on the current site in the summer of 1871. And Mrs. Wardroper decided she needed some experienced sisters, so Anne Blundell returned to St Thomas's in September 1871 to take charge of the obstetric ward, Adelaide. For the next 5 years, she was known as Sister Adelaide, working under the obstetric physician Robert Barnes. During her time as Sister Adelaide, she was responsible for some 50 probationers who spent time on the obstetric ward. These included Emmeline Staines, future matron of the Royal Infirmary, Liverpool, Frances Elizabeth Spencer, future matron of Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, and Elizabeth Vincent, for 22 years matron of St Marylebone Workhouse Infirmary. After 5 years, Anne remarried to a china and glassware dealer from Gravesend, and in her early 40s had another daughter. This time, she was able to bring up her own child. Her son became a clerk, and both daughters married clerks. Anne's better financial position as a nurse enabling her children to make their way in the world. The death of her husband in 1902 also left her in a much better financial position. So things had improved for the whole family. She was later living in Catford, South London, and died on the 1st of September 1922 at the age of 86. And so we come to Mary Barker. Mary Barker, the first name nurse on the register, had lost her father at an early age, and she worked with her mother and sisters as a laundress, a hard and potentially dangerous job. At the age of 32, she had been working for some 20 years prior to beginning her training in 1860. She began her training at the old Southwark site, working under Sisters North, Luke, Isaac and Queen, gaining experience on medical and surgical wards. Not long after completing her training, she was sent to the female hospital at the Woolwich Barracks, before being sent to the military hospital at Netley under Miss Stewart. I apologise. Another veteran of the Crimea, and a very autocratic lady superintendent. She was well known for giving a nurse a good slap. She would only accept nurses who were Church of England. Mary, as a devout Anglican, fitted the bill, while her non-conformist colleagues dodged the bullet of working for Stewart. She later returned to St Thomas's, working as Sister Accident. Wardroper noted that she is a good nurse, and her patients, although not at all times so tenderly treated as they might be, will never suffer from neglect. An excellent nurse, very respectable, but has a temper. It was said that Mary sometimes had the devil in her, such was her temper. Mary's mother died, leaving her free to take the next opportunity, which was to accompany Lucy Osborne in 1867 to Australia to be head nurse at the Sydney Hospital. Osborne, of course, had been educated in a private school in Southall, Nottinghamshire. It was Mary who, having got her sea legs, tended to Lucy in her first-class cabin during her bouts of seasickness on the 3-month journey aboard the Dunbar Castle. When they arrived in Sydney, Mary was shocked by the conditions, and as she was to write to Nightingale. She thought the local nurses were slatternly, with enormous crinolines and hair which had not been combed for a week. Vermin were everywhere. When Queen Victoria's son Alfred needed nursing in Sydney, although Mary was the most competent and experienced surgical nurse, Osborne chose Haldane Turriff, who was better educated and perhaps less rough around the edges. It could be Osborne thought the prince was too delicate for, "Hey up, me duck, you look rough." However, Mary remained loyal to the implementing the Nightingale system, and indeed to Lucy Osborne. When the 3-year contract was finished, the other English nurses were let go, apart from Mary, who were deputised at the hospital when Osborne was absent. As Osborne wrote to Florence Nightingale, "Her crotchety temper gets me into many a scrape, and yet I cannot blame her, for it is only worry. She is a faithful creature, and I respect her heartily." Osborne had introduced a change to the naming of the nurses, so now Mary became known as Sister Mary. This change which sounded more like a nun, led to accusations of Osborne trying to impose a religious and Roman Catholic order. A Royal Commission on Public Charities in 1873, which included the management of the hospital and the nursing system, saw Mary as a witness stoutly defending Osborne and pointing out that she was one of the oldest of the Nightingale nurses with unstinting loyalty to Miss Nightingale. The loyalty to Osborne, however, was misplaced, and Osborne, who had grown tired of her, forced her to resign. Having been careful with her savings, she was able to return to England. And after some private work and working at St. Thomas's, Miss Pringle, the superintendent at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, requested Mary to become as night superintendent. She did this job for 2 years, an unrelenting post. Her superintendent notes, however, suggest that the letters to Nightingale had been written by another hand, because they are so different to Mary's notes as superintendent. This was the old infirmary, and conditions were far from ideal, with patients sharing beds or sleeping on mattresses on the floor. During her time, Joseph Lister and a young Conan Doyle were on the staff. In 1877, she was promoted to matron of the convalescent home at Corstorphine. She was now to be referred to as Mrs. Barker, following the tradition of giving older single women the title of Mrs. At first, the infirmary governors appeared very pleased with her work, but by 1882, she had resigned when questions were asked about the management of the home. The imprisonment in 1880 of her beloved elder brother William for stealing may well have unsettled her. She moved to Lancashire to be near her nephews, and the death of her brother in 1885 is said to have begun her decline, resulting in her admission to the Prestwich Asylum. These are but 4 of the stories of these Nottinghamshire pioneers who would be sent to Cardiff, Swansea, Leicester, Derby, Winchester, Northampton, Dorset, Devonport. There needs to be more research on Lucy Ball and the other sisters at St. Thomas's, who were charged with providing on-ward training. Nightingale dismissed the importance of referees, but a greater study of them helps to locate the origins of probationers and how they learnt about the Nightingale scheme. As with Enfield, they saw the real opportunity for these working-class women to access a training and be given employment opportunities. This is a rich seam of history to be mined. So this has been 10% of the book A. What are the other 90%? And where is the headstone of the first Nightingale nurse? Mary, with little chance of recovery, was sent to the annex at Prestwich for chronic and quite incurable patients, where she died in 1891. Patients at Prestwich were buried in communal graves without a headstone. In 2006, a memorial was erected to over 5,000 former patients. So Mary and her fellow patients are not forgotten. At Bromley House Library, there is now a dedication to her in a newly bound Conan Doyle novel. And perhaps Nightingales might want to consider a fitting tribute to this first Nightingale. Thank you.
Stop sharing. Thank you so much, David. That was so interesting. I suppose this is time. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we can see. There's nothing there yet, but we'll give it another couple of minutes and see if anyone does have any questions. And if not, we I think that's the evening. But we'll just give it a moment. Oh, lots of claps coming through. Thank you very much. Diana has asked, were married nurses allowed to continue in nursing?
So, as I mentioned with Anne Blundell, she was a widow with children, so she continued because she was a widow. I don't think there's any particular evidence of married women nursing?
As far as
Not certainly not in any of the 25 women from Nottinghamshire. And I'm pretty certain for most of all the others, it just wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, just to add to this, the marriage bar for nurses in the training school continued through till sort of the 1960s. The Nightingale Training School was quite late. In its getting rid of the marriage bar. A lot of other nursing training institutions allowed women to get married beforehand. We did find we have come across the few anomalies, as obviously you found some were married that came in, and there were women such as Kofarola Abini Pratt, who came over from Nigeria, who was married yet was still allowed in 1945. So as much as it was most women were single, there do seem to be a few anomalies that we've sort of come across.
So a couple of questions. Yes, Diane, the 2/3 did go on to get married, but once they got married, they stopped nursing, unless like in the situation of Nurse Wrigley, because she became a widow, she was able to resume her career as and I've seen this in several cases where women have had considerable careers after becoming a widow. They sort of went back to nursing. Lindsay asking in terms of how did you get involved? Well, this particular was in terms of looking for something else entirely, looking to see whether somebody actually had trained at St Thomas's, realizing that they hadn't. But as I was looking through the register, suddenly seeing Mrs Enfield's name, who I knew very well, excuse me, from previous work, and Nottingham being mentioned. So that's really how I got interested. Somebody asking if I'll come and talk, which I'm more than happy to do. If they went back. Want to answer that one from Martin?
So Martin has asked if they went back, so assuming if they went back to St Thomas's, did they have to be retrained? Was there any sense that medicine and nursing were changing rapidly? That's a very good question.
Well, I think in terms of, we mentioned the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh, and you've got Lister there, yes, things were changing. And a greater expectation of what nurses were being asked to do.
I'm unfortunately, I'm not 100% sure if they would have had to have undergone further training after returning. Martin's clarified because of widowhood.
No, I think not the ones I've seen. They just just enables them to go back to becoming a nurse. Did things different from hospital? Yeah, certainly what you get in terms of did things different change from hospital to hospital hugely. I mean, we mentioned the Nottingham General Hospital, where the governors had absolutely refused to get engaged with training. But in 1868, things changed at the Nottingham General when Charles Paget, no longer an MP, comes onto the weekly board, as does the brother-in-law of Mrs Enfield, and they begin demanding that they should be training at Nottingham General Hospital. So things did change, but it took quite a long time, and that's why people had gone down to London, because there was nothing for them to do in Nottingham until about the late 1860s, 1870.
So Philip's just said, I think having done initial training, that would have been enough. Plus the Nightingale trained was the gold standard of the day.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Philip. Yeah, yes.